All the people he knows, there's nobody he knows who even comes close to understanding the technique and the technical aspect of Southworth and Hawes like the world expert you are about to hear, Mr. Mike Robinson. His wife came down from Toronto just to hear this talk. Mike.
Thank you, everybody. And first I'd like to say it's really a pleasure and honor for me to be up here to really share my passion with all of my sleep-deprived friends. And before I begin, I need to extend a thank you to Grant Romer, Sheila Foster, Matthew Eisenberg, and Irving Poborowski, for their support and help with my research. My research began about 2 years ago when I was having dinner with Grant and Irving, and Grant said to me, "Mike, do you think you could figure out what were the techniques used by Southworth and Hawes to support their artistic vision?" And I want you to keep that in mind. I'm going to be talking about mundane things like technique. But keep in mind that all of these techniques were devised to support the overriding artistic vision of Southworth and Hawes. And so what was that artistic vision? I think the easiest way to explain it is to use the artist's own words. And I'd like to share with you Albert Southworth's sentiments about their own work. "Our plates are the largest and most highly polished and have a more perfect surface. Our pictures have a surprising delicacy in their finish. There is no sameness in our positions and use of the light, it being adapted to the design of showing every face in its best view. As far as possible, we imitate nature in her most beautiful forms. By a mellow blending of lights and shades, an artistic effect of drapery and figure, forcible expression, a pleasing air, and startling animation, representing thought, action, and feeling or soul." I'd now like to share with you my investigations into the techniques in a step-by-step progression, from the very beginning of their plate preparation through to the final development with mercury. In doing my research, I needed to find out clues. How did they prepare a plate? And I had to read a number of articles. Probably the greatest resource was what Southworth wrote in the 1852 Massachusetts Register when he's describing their techniques. And the first thing I came across was how they prepared their silver plate. And Southworth writes, "We silver all of our plates every time we try them." Now I need to explain this briefly. The daguerreotype plate is silver over copper, available from the manufacturers in relatively good condition, ready to use with polishing by the operator. But resilvering is applying an additional very fine layer of silver to the highly polished existing silver plate. And on the right here, that's a 19th century wet battery, which may possibly have been used in this process to apply by the electric current a very fine additional deposit of silver. Now, I've long believed that 19th century resilvering is a much different deposit of silver than what we can get with modern electroplated plates. So I needed to investigate what was the nature of this 19th century deposit. And the greatest resource I've came across is this book written by Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros, a Parisian amateur government official, probably the finest landscape Daguerrean, in my opinion, who ever lived. And he wrote this 110-page treatise on how he did his work in 1850 after returning from Athens. And literally 1/3 of this book is dedicated to all of the minutiae of applying a silver to a plate. Baron Gros was known as the Napoleon of the plate. Here's one of his pieces, a wonderful piece done at the Crystal Palace in London. Another great view in Paris. And this third from Athens. And in the book, Baron Gros reveals the secret. A full plate will have taken on about 8 decigrams of silver in 1 hour's time and have a beautiful cream white tint, lightly sky blue. This is the key that unlocked it for me. Silver deposits at 4 grams in 1 amp in 1 hour's time, and this is 1/5 of that. So I now knew the power of the electrical current to use. And believe me, the rate at which the silver is deposited on the plate by the current density has a remarkable effect on how the outcome turns out. Baron Gros also writes, so if you don't believe that resilvering works, try it out yourself. Take a plate and resilver half of it, and then make an image on it and see what happens. And so I did. Here we have a clad silver plate, polished to a mirror finish, on which the left side I've applied an additional silver coating. Now this is before is polished. It does now need to be polished again to a mirror finish. Here's the image that resulted. Now look carefully at this and you'll see some differences between the resilvered side on the left and the plain clad silver copper side on the right. There is more information in the midtones and shadows. The whites are remarkably brighter. And then if you look closely at this area, particularly at the whites, up in the center at the top, the white of the book on the resilvered side is much brighter than the plain clad side. And if we look at it at 500 times magnification, we can see in the highlight side, the image particles are much more densely packed, scattering light much more efficiently and appearing quite a bit brighter. And in the shadow side, you even have more image particles formed, indicating a gain in photographic speed. So here is a silver plate I have prepared under Baron Gros' recommendations. And the thickness of this deposit is on the realm of 2 microns thick, which is not very thick. On the other hand, I have in my collection that I obtained from Matthew Eisenberg 2 half plates from the Southworth and Hawes studio, which were resilvered but never used, indicating the thickness of the silver deposit that they preferred to use. And this is 1/3 of a micron thick. Now that's a remarkable difference between 2 very fine operators. Baron Gros preferred to reuse his plates often. A silver deposit that's 2 microns thick does require very aggressive polishing. You need to go right back to the most coarsest abrasives of rotten stone followed by rouge and lampblack before you could make a successfully polished plate. On the other hand, the lightly sky blue 1/3 of a micron thick deposit used by Southworth and Hawes polishes very readily with the finest abrasives. And so I propose that perhaps one reason why we have so many Southworth and Hawes plates extant is that you can't really successfully reuse a plate if you're going to reapply silver this thinly. You do need to apply a little thicker deposit. And so to preserve the perfection each and every time they made an image, by using a virgin plate and applying a very thin additional deposit to their preference would give them the consistency required to sustain a high level of work. Now, just to reinforce that it's not electroplating versus clad which makes the difference, here are two plates from the Southworth and Hawes studio. On the left is a clad plate, resilvered with their own preferred deposit. On the right is an electroplated plate made by Christoffel, again resilvered with their own preferred electroplated deposit. A plate with that kind of deposit, as I said, polishes very readily with the finest abrasives. Now this machine, this is a patent drawing of the self-regulating suspension swing arm plate polisher. It was invented and patented in 1846 by Southworth and Hawes. It was marketed by Scoville, who with great enthusiasm said, "We plan to get one on to every operator in the United States in a year's time." It was a financial disaster. A year later, it was noticed that these things were gathering dust on Scoville's shelves. Now, why is that so? I believe this machine was designed to mimic the action of polishing a plate where the plate is held at hand and polished with the other hand. And so the plate surface and the buff paddle are kept in constant level contact through the entire stroke by the action of both hands. Well, if you're a daguerreotypist working with a 6 plate, why would you bother spending $12 to buy this when you can very easily do it in hand? Southworth and Hawes preferred to work with full plates when they could, and believe me, that would be a much more daunting task to polish a full plate by holding it in hand. And here we see a replica of this patent machine that I've had my brother-in-law built, and you can see the action of how it works. There is even contact with the plate and the buff through the entire stroke. Southworth and Hawes were so proud of the way they polished the plates that they felt it necessary to include it as the last line in this advertisement. Plates perfectly polished. They neither use steam, humbug by false pretenses, nor wear laurels won by competitors. And a direct attack to their close rival John Adams Whipple, who advertised daguerreotypes by steam. I showed this plate to say that a perfectly polished surface was not always the case with Southworth and Hawes daguerreotype. The greatest challenge in working as a daguerreotypist is to obtain a perfectly blank white background. Getting an even tone across a high key background is a daunting challenge, and any subtle undulation in the plate surface or in the polish will show up as uneven sensitizing in the plate. Now here we have a daguerreotype of Roland Neal, and I think, although not quite perfectly polished, I think the artist recognized that this undulating background was quite sympathetic with the hairdo. On the other hand, this is the tour de force that I just spoke about. This image has an even bone white surface that only the most accomplished Daguerrean artists would dare to attempt. The majority of daguerreotypes you'll find are photographed with a medium tone to dark background to hide unevenness in plate preparation. Once you have a perfectly polished plate, the next job was to sensitize it. Now this is my sensitizing box. It is modeled after a French design. I don't know what Southworth and Hawes used, other than I do recall reading them writing that they had coating boxes 2 feet square. Well, it's not really the size of the equipment, it's how you use it. What I want to speak about now is something that really is difficult to express using a PowerPoint presentation. I really encourage you to go back into the gallery and have a look at the subtleties of what I'm trying to talk about. So this fine portrait of a man, I say, is he pink or is he green? Well, it depends on how you look at him. I'm of a particular height that when I'm looking at that image, he has a green complexion. And when I dip my knees, so I'm looking at it from 4 inches lower, his face flips to a wonderful, almost lifelike skin tone pink. Now, this is not unique with Southworth and Hawes, but it is quite prevalent in their work. And I've always been really enamored and fascinated by the beauty of plate color in a daguerreotype. Another example of this kind of work is in this wonderful full plate landscape by Baron Grove. Those of you who have seen this plate marvel at the pink skies and the green grass in this image. This is at the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal, Canada. Now, reading Baron Grove's treatise, he does give his secret on sensitizing. He says, I prefer to use bromine in combination with chlorine for wonderful image tone. And a brief line in Southworth and Hawes' writings say that they use iodine, bromine, and chlorine in their preparations. So I thought I'd give it a try. By adding chlorine to my bromine, for the first time I was able to get those wonderful pink skies with green water in this landscape. And just another point of clarification. The image on the left is an image prepared with bromine only as the quick stuff. And although it is nicely warm toned, they tend to be on the yellowish side. Now, it's probably not the best vehicle to show this, but I'm hoping you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. The image of my daughter on the right, now the pink tones here are hand applied. Don't be confused here. But in her clothing, in the plate in life, has this wonderful pink hue. Now I'll show a few Southworth and Hawes examples which really do have this wonderful image color. Now, with the plate sensitized, we now have to work in the operating room. And Grant, in his talk yesterday, gave you an idea of what the operating room, where it was located, what it looked like. And I want to reinforce the fact that the operating room really is key in understanding the style of Southworth and Hawes. Here we have the front of the studio on Tremont Row. If you were looking out of the dormer windows in the attic that you see here, you'd be looking east towards the harbor. You can see in this particular room the pyramidal shaped skylight, which had a base of 12 by 16 foot. I think it's unique in the Daguerrean era. I don't know of any other studio that had a light such as this. Keep in mind that this shape would collect light like a lantern throughout the entire day, allowing them an extended working time and complete flexibility to move about the operating room space. Here's an overhead view of the skylight. Notice the two smaller skylights that Grant mentioned yesterday. You have the larger one which goes down 2 flights, and then the smaller one illuminating the staircase up to the attic rooms. But it's the main light which is in the operating room. The red line indicates what is the working floor space of the operating room. Now it's 45 feet in length by 21 feet across in the rectangle. The corner notched out in the lower corner is the space taken up by the ladies' room, or the ladies' dressing room, where the ladies were prepared for their sitting. I've redrawn it for you so you can have an easier interpretation of what's about to come next. Here we have the operating room. You can see the compass directions. Keep those in mind when you look at the upcoming images and try to imagine where the sun may be at the time the image was taken. Now, we have the ladies' room here, once again. We have a space which I'm going to refer to as the cove, for lack of a better term, in a space not taken up or next to the ladies' room. We have a dotted line which represents the roof beam, which is evident in a few images. Of course, the skylight on the flat part of the roof, the 4 dormer windows, and the widened exit to the hall and the reception room. Another thing to notice is that these walls here were painted in a light color, and I believe the cove walls were painted in a dark color. So now I'd like to give you a 360-degree virtual tour of this operating room. And we'll begin in the cove. Now, let me explain this yellow triangle. Southworth and Hawes experimented with lenses, and we don't know exactly what kind of focal lengths those may have been, but we do know for a fact that they did use Voigtlander lenses. There are bills of sales for half and full plate lenses in Matthew's collection and in the Eastman House papers here. Now, I use Voigtlander lenses in my own work, and so I can tell you precisely the angle of coverage that a Voigtlander full plate lens will give you on a full plate when shot horizontally. It's 45 degrees, and when shot in portrait format, it's 35 degrees. And so knowing that angle of coverage that the lens gives to a plate, I was able to use the visual architectural clues of the shot and then precisely determine, or not precise, pretty closely determine, where Hawes or Southworth may have stood behind the camera. So the yellow triangle you'll see in the schematic represents the coverage of the lens, and the green dot is Mr. Hawes or Southworth. I may mix them up. Now the image, of course, let's try to ignore the beautiful applied patterned background, but look at the image itself. And here we see a shot beginning in the cove. The sitter is illuminated by the skylight, and there is a gentle backlight from the dormer window. This is the only dormer window in the operating room where the adjacent wall does not finish off in a 45-degree angle with the roof line. It goes directly to the floor. I have to say here that these images I'm showing may look odd to you because I've actually reversed them in Photoshop so that they look as if Hawes was looking directly at the sitter. So we don't get confused as we give our 360-degree counterclockwise tour through the space. Backing up and shooting on axis with the ladies' room wall. This is the ladies' room wall here. Here's the dormer window in the cove area. Here's a silhouette of Brattle Street Church. By stepping 2 feet to the left and a little bit closer, Brattle Street Church moves to fill the window space. This image is unique in that the photographer has chosen to make a first exposure of the seated gentleman with the window curtained off, if you will, and then draw the curtain aside, refocus the lens on the distant church, and give a brief second exposure. So you record sharp detail in the sitter as well as the distant background. Now if Hawes picked up his camera and walked directly to that window, this is the scene that would open up before him. Moving around to the north wall, just east of the hallway entrance, we see we're still working in the cove area with a darkened painted wall, and this wall is fixed in place. You'll notice the white baseboard, the carpeting, and here's the first view I'll show you of the column. This column was probably lightweight and tended to move around. it came in 3 pieces. Hawes or Southworth could assemble it as they wished. But keep in mind, they are using this column to hide an architectural transition or hide a seam from perhaps a false wall, to give the illusion of a much grander space. So here we have the dark wall of the cove, and to the left of the column is something light colored. It could either be a panel placed there, or it could be the hallway wall, I'm not sure. And this is Matthew's chair, and it struck me as odd. I'd never noticed that Matthew's chair had 5 legs before. This is the foot of a 3-footed headstand. Now if we move along to the other wall, which is now painted white, you can see once again the technique of trying to hide the architectural space, the details. They've got the plant covering the corner. This, I believe, is a little earlier in the evolution of their style, and they've used a white curtain to hide the darkening, receding space into the corner of the room, and semi-successfully hidden the edge of that white curtain with a column. This is a really wonderful image to show the west wall of the entire studio. This image has 25 women in it. This image, I believe, was made to satisfy their artistic sensibilities. Hawes or Southworth are pretty much as far back as they can get in the studio space so that the Voigtlander lens could cover the 25 feet of expanse it needs to fill the frame. It was shot in the morning. Southworth writes that with large groups, they need to work in a strong light for exposures in the 2 to 3 second range. The sun rises in the east. It's coming through the overhead light, directly illuminating the sitters. And the sunlight illuminating the sitters is in fact bright enough to allow the exposure with the dormer windows uncovered. And the dormer windows are less intense because they're facing the west and not solarizing. If this one is the artistic interpretation, this next one is more representational. In the earlier shot, there were 3 ladies that were in silhouette through the dormer windows. This one, I believe, was meant to satisfy the needs of every sitter to have their face clearly seen. First, I'd like to point out that they're seated in a semicircular fashion so that each face will fit into the curved plane of a Voigtlander focus. A 19th century lens does not have a flat focus field. It's like shooting into a bowl. And you need to carefully place the sitters into that very, very unique focus plane. We also, I believe this was shot in the afternoon. It now becomes necessary to mask off the bright light coming in through the dormer windows. And here we have a first clue of some of their operating equipment. Here we have a very large white, I'll call it a false wall. It even has a baseboard on it. It's painted the same color as the majority of the studio space. And they also had a dark wall, which was shorter in height. And this time they've thrown a white cloth over it to try and get a uniform, relatively uniform white background. And to hide the division between the 2 false walls, they've placed the column. Again, it was shot in the afternoon. It's likely the sun is coming more directly into the camera lens. And to redirect the light back onto the sitters, they've done the technique known as bagging down, with a very large sailcloth hanging overhead, which will screen the light from coming into the camera and redirect it back onto the sitters. Continuing our 360-degree rotation, now we have this wonderful shot of Daniel Webster, and Daniel is standing directly under the skylight. You can see that his eyes are in deep shadow the shadow under the nose is coming straight down, and he has a fair bit of illumination on the top of his head. The column is placed perhaps to mask off some light coming in from the dormer window. From the same vantage point, only further back, we have this nice image from the Jack Naylor collection, again using the column to mask off light. But what I like to point out here is this is probably the clearest example of foreknown poses in which the headstand used by Southworth and Hawes can be clearly seen. They designed a special base of their very own, a flat, 8-sided metal plate with a pipe on it, which will be hidden by the legs. And so the headstand, when seen in the shot, doesn't look like the headstands that we know of in other daguerreotypes. It's very, very discreet, if you will. The other images where this headstand is visible is the stereo pair of Erastus Hopkins in the exhibition. Also from the same sitting, portraits of Kossuth. And the other one I know of is Ray Phillips' image of the young boy holding a rabbit. It's also in the exhibition. Those are the only ones I know of where this particular headstand is visible. Moving around to the south wall, this I think is getting into a favored area for Southworth and Hawes. The sitters never have to deal with direct light coming into their eyes. To photograph this large group, Southworth has really had to back out of the operating room into the hallway. Now we move into another favored corner. This is predominantly the south wall with the corner of the ladies' room wall visible. Again, the column is brought in. Notice they've hung pictures on the wall about 10 feet high, which one would never do in a home, but they're trying to create the illusion that this was photographed in perhaps a well-to-do parlor of the sitter's home, not in a photographic studio. A little further around the rotation, we see more of the ladies' room wall. You notice that they've actually hung pictures on the ladies' room door to try and mask the fact that it's a door. They brought the column in to hide it. You quite often see the shorter column with the picture over in this area. And now this wonderful shot. Hawes has literally jammed himself up against the south wall. The column's used to hide the door frame in the ladies' room. And the bride is looking directly over her right shoulder, with the light now striking predominantly from on a 45-degree angle. And to complete our 360-degree tour of the studio space, we have this shot with the ladies' room door actually left open, where you can see into the ladies' room and the dormer window in the distance, and Grandma in the other corner, waiting for the exposure to be completed. This image I felt quite curious about what is actually going on here. How could Hawes leave the door open? I've worked, where I've been very intently focused on trying to get the pose right of the sitter, and I've missed things in the background. Now, could Hawes have suffered the same thing? He's working on the pose and didn't notice Grandma leaving the ladies' room and sitting in the corner and leaving the door open. I could forgive that once. But there are two. Now I had to think about this. How could he make two of these mistakes? Well, I suppose if he shot two plates in rapid succession, possible. But then I started to look at the plates with more a careful eye. And I noticed on the plate on the left, these are 6 plates. And they were supplied by the manufacturer with all 4 edges turned down slightly. And that turning down was to prevent the edge of the plate from catching on the buff during the polishing. This plate has 3 turned down edges. And the left edge is trimmed away. Now the swing arm polisher for 6th plate grips the plate on all 4 edges, and this plate could not be used in that polisher in this condition. So I have to assume that it was trimmed after the image was made. Well, now I look at the other plate, and strangely enough, the right edge has been trimmed away. And then it struck me. When you bring the edges together, you have a great stereo pair. Another detail, notice the hallmark on this plate. It's in the lower left corner. On this plate, it's in the upper right. When you're taking a stereo in this presentation fashion, you have to be very conscious of where you place those hallmarks. He had to know that he had to put the left plate in the right plate holder with the hallmark up, and the right plate in the left plate holder with the hallmark down. Now, if you have to spend that much attention in getting this right, I have to assume that the door was left open absolutely intentionally to enhance the stereo effect and depth of space. And that is also why Granny's in the background. I realized that this was one of their early stereo presentation techniques after seeing this plate that's in Dennis's collection. This, I'll be bold and say, this is the first attempt that they made with this presentation technique. Because once you make the mistake of not putting the hallmark in the right place, I can't believe Southworth and Hawes, with their attention to detail, would make that mistake twice. This image also is very experimental in that they're trying to enhance the perceived depth in the image by altering the focus from the left and right image, which looks really quite confusing in this manner. But when you put it to your eye and view it in stereo and have both images meld in your mind, you do get an enhanced stereo effect. Enhanced depth of field effect. Now I'd like to speak about some exposing techniques. And this is what's known as the illuminated camera technique, which is a fancy way of saying, let's paint the camera white inside. Now, Hawes revealed this trade secret in 1851 after reading a French publication announcing this new discovery that using a camera with a white interior increased photographic speed and mellowed out the tones. And Southworth replied, "We've been using this technique for 6 years." How did it work? The white camera causes light coming through the lens to bounce around and give a non-image forming additional illumination to the shadows, the shadow areas of the image. It doesn't affect the whites. It's very similar to flashing a print. When you're making a print in the darkroom and you want to bring up shadow detail, you have a little bit of flash with non-image forming light, and it boosts up the shadow detail. Well, notice on the image where I've used the dark camera, I've taken 2 half plates here, and I've prepared them as identically as I could possibly can. And you'll notice that with the dark camera, I'm showing the scene as well so you can get an inference of what the color of the subject is. Now, browns, yellows, and reds are extremely difficult to render tone and detail in a daguerreotype. This is a predominantly ultraviolet and blue sensitive process. So in the dark camera, we don't have image information into the deep recesses of the cabinet. We can hardly make out the pleats and the bellows. We don't see much detail in the trunk. When you line the camera with white paper and allow some non-image forming light to boost the shadow exposure, we now have fully revealed information. I can see into the cabinet, I can see the tone of the trunk, and I can see the bellows. And the whites are fairly similar. This is one of the techniques Southworth used to smooth out and mellow the tones so you had an even gradation from the highlights to the shadows and not a coarse salt and peppery look. I also use this technique to illustrate Bates Lowry's article, Secrets of the White Chamber. This is a photograph of the most beautiful woman in the world. And she is in common with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, after sitting for a daguerreotype, "I must sit again, or I must not sit again, not having the complexion with which daguerre and iodine delight in." And what he's speaking about is that complexions with red hues in them photograph in an exaggerated fashion. And Fiona on the right in the dark camera, you can see she looks quite freckled. Of course, if you see her up in the balcony there, she doesn't have nearly freckles that look like this. When you photograph with the white camera, you smooth out the shadow tones, make them more mellow. You gain about 1/3 of a stop in speed and get a much more pleasing rendition. It's great to see the Young America book put together so many images and match them so that we can compare plates from the same sitting. So I've done that, and I pulled out a few images from the Eastman House collection to show you what I believe are differences with white camera exposure and dark camera exposure. And look at the tones and the shadows. Look at the difference in the contrast of the plates. You know, the white camera kind of removed the earrings too. The effect is subtle. You couldn't line a modern camera with white paper. You'd flare it to a very be useless, a useless image. But it works very successfully with the daguerreotype. At first thought, this is what I thought I was looking at, a comparison between the white and dark camera. When I saw the actual plates on the wall, I realized right away that that wasn't the case. I believe the image on the right is still taken with a white camera, but notice how the image on the left has taken 20 years off this lady. That this is a very early example of retouching. They very successfully applied color to the plate. This image is fully colored, well, subtly colored. There's blue or green tints in the dress. But they've also applied color that precisely matched the tone of the daguerreotype to the crow's feet in the woman's eyes, and blending and smoothing the lines of her face.
Building the hairpiece.
Yeah. And so the image particles are very similar in size to the retouching pigment particles. And so you don't see the effect of them unless you look at the plate from a very, very oblique angle just to reveal the tinting. But if you apply tinting that precisely matches the tone of the plate, you can give retouching. The final technique I'd like to speak about is how they use the mercury. Now these are mercury baths. This is in Matthew Eisenberg's collection. We have a full plate, half plate, and a quarter plate mercury bath. And you can see that there's a thermometer on the full plate bath, which would give the photographer an indication to the temperature used. You can literally develop a daguerreotype at any temperature you choose within reason. Jeremiah Gurney promoted the use of a very warm mercury, around 195 degrees, for example, for a very short time. Baron Groh recommended 145 degrees for anywhere between 7 and 8 minutes. It's kind of like developing film today, where you can use a more active developer for a short time, or you can dilute the developer and go for a longer time. But each method does have its benefits and its drawbacks. Of course, if you want to save time, developing over hot mercury for a short time is really beneficial. But quite often, the artifact you get when you're developing over hot mercury is, if you look on the image on the left, it's an enlargement of a head and a quarter plate. And you can see that the deep shadows of this image are dotted with mercury particles, image particles, if you will. We call this Daguerrean frosting. Okay? This is what happens when you use very warm mercury. The image on the right, Southworth was asked once by a correspondent who said, "You've told me to develop for 70 degrees. How can I do that when it's 75 degrees in my studio?" Well, Southworth was speaking about Celsius, which translates to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. So, using that reference, I began to develop my plates for a lower temperature over an extended period of time. And I noticed that the image particles in the shadows, and this is an image, it's a head of a man from a full plate daguerreotype, which compared to the man on the left is half the size. And when I blow them up to the same size, there are still no image particles in these shadows. No visible image particles anyway. Under a microscope you'd see it. But they're so fine that that promotes the liquid black tonalities and gentle gradations to the deepest shadows, which you can accomplish with using a lower temperature development over an extended period of time. Another benefit of using a lower temperature mercury over an extended period of time is that you can develop the high key areas to a very brilliant white and convert what might solarize at a higher temperature over a shorter time to a white. So they were able to maintain brilliant whites even in cases of extreme exposure by using a low temperature over a longer time. And that effect was graphically revealed to me when Irving Poborowski and I last month, in experimenting with some of these techniques, when I did this self-portrait of Irving. This is in Irving's backyard, and the sun is coming directly into the lens, coming through Irving's hair and off his shoulder, being extremely bright, and the deep shadows caused by the direction of the light. There's information in well over a 10-stop, 13-stop range. No film could handle this. And this is the magic of the daguerreotype for me, to be able to render this kind of extreme contrast when done well. And to sum up, using the words of Southworth, if you want to make pictures so that every time you take it up, you will see new beauties in it. Thank you very much. Be happy to take any questions.
It is still 10:05. Does anybody have any questions for him? We have another few minutes. One question over here.
Mike, first of all, thanks for a really wonderful and illuminating presentation. But
Oh, don't have to give him a mic.
thanks for a wonderful and illuminating presentation. I think you're all tremendously impressed. At the Feigenbaum sale, when we were looking through large numbers of Southworth plates, many of us for the first time, we noticed a kind of, on many of them, a kind of pearl-like surface, almost an opalescence in the highlights especially. I'm wondering if you have any idea whether they might have used a varnish that did that, or if there's any chemical explanation for it.
Was it retinted? Was it retouched? No. The pearl surface is evident on plain plates. I've noticed that the nature of the silver deposit, the galvanic deposit, in combination with everything else, mercury, sensitizing, will give you that pearlescent, somewhat matte kind of look. That doesn't need that. I've seen that in my plates, and I don't varnish them. On the other hand, they did hand tint some plates using a technique where they dust on over the entire surface, not by brushing locally. And that technique often used a wash of some sort to help the image particles, or the coloring particles, adhere to the plate. The only way to tell is to do some high-level elemental analysis on a plate like that.
In Irving's portrait, did you combine the white camera with the low temperature development?
No, didn't use the white camera in this case. What I used was, we used an inadvertent very heavy coating of iodine. And when you put a heavy coating of iodine, you reduce the contrast of the plate. Go ahead, Bruce.
No, I just was wondering if there's a difference between the frequency with which they use the white camera with the male or the female sitters.
I don't know. I've seen some male portraits where it looks like they've used the white camera, but I think if you look at a good flavor for it is just to thumb through those images in the Young America book and turn them. I think predominantly they favored the white camera for women, but it's hard to tell until you look at the plates.
Do you think it would have been possible for you to do this analysis without being a contemporary daguerreotypist?
Absolutely not.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I just think we heard a groundbreaking lecture that will not be forgot for a long time.